for us that,
Apologies.
just turn your.
Got it.
Just say no. One of the things I just want to make, this is a simple statement for the committee. Nonprofit housing doesn't mean no profit housing. The housing is a business. It has to break even at the very least. I mean, in the financial setup that we'll hear a little bit later through the Vermont Housing Finance Agency and how some of those tax credit programs work. It's really important to understand. When I served on the board of one of the nonprofit housing agencies, that you learned very early on that it's a business. It's still a business. You cannot have a project like any of these that Gus has shown that lose money. It's just so a lot of this work that goes into sustainability, into the questions of how to keep it going and how to keep it perpetual is that this is part of the even though there are tax credit programs, even though there might be money available through this program or that program, if the projects can't make their nut and they have to be sold because they're just not working, then we didn't succeed or they didn't succeed in all this technical, in setting up the program. I just want to. It seems too simple to me to say that, but I think that's really important to just understand on the top that it still has to make money.
It has to cash flow. It has to pay for its expenses, which includes the cost of management, the cost of property taxes, because all these projects pay property taxes. It has to pay for its insurance costs. It has to pay for its fuel bills. And increasingly, and we'll go to this slide, it has to figure out how to make sure that residents have the services that they need. You should have some time with Cathedral Square and folks from Southern Vermont about the SASH program. I'm not going to talk about it at any length today, but it's a statewide program that initially has been funded through Medicare and is shown to bring healthcare costs down by doing preventive services.
And SASH stands for?
Support and services at home.
It's modeled all over the state. It has about 5,000 elders who participate in it. There's lots of other kinds of service supports that are provided through our network, often in partnership with the women's services community. But in 2015 or 16, Governor Shumlin issued an executive order, and that executive order asked that if you got public subsidies, you set aside 15% of your housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. At that time, we were at about 12% across the state, folks who had at one point or another been homeless and then got housed. We're now up to about 22% across the state. During the pandemic, 1 in 3 vacancies, almost 700 apartments that we are funders of, went to somebody experiencing homelessness. Some people experience homelessness simply because they lost a job and they need to get back on their feet. But other people are really struggling with addiction, various mental health crises, with other kinds of problems and need supports. And we have a mental health system that is really struggling right now. We have a whole system of homeless service providers across the state, groups like the Committee on Temporary Shelter, Groundworks in Brattleboro, the Haven in the Upper Valley. And they're competing in a labor market that is just really difficult for them to get the employees they need. And so more and more you're seeing some of our housing nonprofit developers, in addition to doing housing management, actually wanting to have a services division on their staff to make sure that when there's a crisis, they can pay attention to it dramatically. It would be best, I think, in my opinion, Maura would share this, if service organizations could just simply provide all the services people needed, but it's not happening consistently across the state. So that's an issue I'm sure you'll deal with at a different time in a different hearing. And again, there's a whole range of need. One of the things you did last year as a General Assembly was to create some funding for some pilot projects. As you heard from the parents of folks with intellectual disabilities who are trying to figure out long-term options as they age and their kids age and they get longer, be able to help them. And that's something we've worked on in the past. Late Secretary Con Hogan would have told you that we never would have closed Brandon without the assistance that our network provided. But there's a new generation and we need some new models to help with those folks as well. Smart growth in downtowns is at the core of our mission. There isn't a downtown in the state that we have not had some impact on. In South Burlington, it's a new town center. St. Albans has used its TIF district funding to support a lot of affordable housing development. We have an application in front of us for 72 unit development that'll go to our January board meeting in the downtown. But we also have restored a ton of historic buildings across the state. The building you see in Springfield is a partnership with a local economic development organization. They master leased all the commercial space and they're responsible for that, while we restored the upper floors as housing. In Brattleboro, that was a strip mall right in the downtown. We recreated the streetscape. It is now home to the food co-op that supports more than 100 farms. But the co-op only needed 2 stories, and they said to the local nonprofit, would you like to build above us? And so we created 28 apartments. This building won an EPA Smart Growth Award, and just is a tremendous success in recreating the streetscape, giving a place for folks to live in the downtown. Rural community gathering places. It's not appropriate to build necessarily in every small town, but we are doing housing in Putney right now. We're not in Brookfield, but we've helped communities with rural community assets like those that you see here. The old Grange building in Morrisville is now a Center for the Arts. We are building housing just across the street from that site as well. But it's just for those of you from rural communities, as with the Paulette Library, it's a way that we, with our historic preservation mission, help rural communities. We've done 3 or 4 store projects. If you travel Route 14, you'll see the East Calais General Store, which does have 3 apartments in it under renovation now. The community's found a new operator for the store. Diversity, equity, inclusion is a core value. Equity is a part of this committee's charge, as I understand it now. And you worked on a number of issues related to equity last year. We've been active in promoting both the education of all of our partners in this realm, as well as creating programs that benefit them. And even our conservation organizations like the Catamount Trail Association are being very active in helping kids experience the outdoors. One of the things you asked us to do was to stand up a land access and opportunity board. You had a lot of testimony on that last year. The board's been meeting every 2 weeks since late July. They'll be delivering a report to you in the middle of February. It'll be a little later than we hoped, but they are working on that. Yeah, this is a slide you saw in the presentation, if you attended, that I made to the whole General Assembly, but I think this is as instructive as any I can think of why we have a housing problem today, not just in Vermont, but across the United States. And so the 3 lines that you see, the blue line is median household income, and it's gone up a little bit, but stayed relatively flat for a long time. The yellow line is how the cost of rental housing has gone up, and the orange line, the housing price. And I said this to all of you before, but I'll repeat myself. In 1971, when I rented my first apartment, it cost $105. Yeah.
Thank you.
When I rented my first apartment, just out of high school in 1971, it cost $105 a month. Back then, I was still in New York. I was driving a cab. I made about $100 a week, 3 nights a week, driving a cab. So 25% of my income went to that apartment. And you see these 3 lines were just about on top of each other in 1970. So whether you were a low-wage worker like me or somebody more in the middle, most housing was affordable to most Americans. Something's changed over the years. You can blame it on globalization, flattening incomes, or the weakness of the labor movement, or our regulations related to housing development. But the fact is that we have had a growing gap, whether you are a renter or a homeowner, in what somebody with a median income can afford. It's harder some places than others. If any of you know people who have kids who've moved to the Bay Area, it's beyond imagination to find a house, half a house for less than $1 million. But our problems here have also gotten worse over time. And what we need to do then is to lower the cost of housing. And we do that generally in two ways. One is capital subsidies to bring the cost back down so that the amount of debt is low enough that somebody can afford it, homeowner or renter. Or we provide things like rental assistance to help people who can't afford the rent. Rental assistance primarily comes from the federal government. The state has provided some funding for rental assistance as well, but it's primarily a federal program, and it's not an entitlement. Not everybody who's eligible gets rental assistance in Vermont. Here's what's happened to housing supply. I'm not going to dwell for a long time other than to thank VHFA, but fair to say, over the last 4 decades, every decade, the rate of construction in Vermont has gone down. One of the things you find since the meltdown is that banks don't want to finance condominiums, which would be an affordable way to home ownership. And the reason they don't want to finance them is after the meltdown, they basically said, unless you can show us 50% pre-sales, we're not going to give you a loan to put a stick in the ground in case they don't sell. So we've had a stoppage of, there's no developers that I know of who are regularly going and building what happened in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, of building a 1,200 square foot caper ranch. My fire chief, I was a volunteer firefighter, went up and down the county road, and over 10 years, he probably built 7 of those kinds of homes. You can't get financing for that kind of development anymore. You can't get financing for and if you're a carpenter, and some of us were talking about this today, the opportunity to make a lot of money building multi-million-dollar houses is just a whole lot more lucrative than building minimal houses. So we've lost that part of the industry. It's a major problem for all of us. Here again, thanks to Maura and her team, and maybe she'll update this, but between the cost of housing going up and interest rates going up, you've cut in half the number theoretically of renters who have enough income to buy that median priced Vermont home. And interest rates are higher today than they were back in October.
Ask a question about that.
Please.
When you're kind of thinking about what's your metric of affordability when you're saying what's baked into this? Is it a third of income? Is that what counts as somebody who would be able to afford it? As if, you know, the total mortgage payments would be a third of their income? Is that the metric?
Basically, it's about 30%. The feds say that you're not paying too much for your housing if you're spending 30% of your income. When you go to the mortgage lenders, and Maura is far more the expert than I, then there's a total cost of debt that you can have in order to be financed, and you may get above 30%. You know, we consider anybody who's a renter to be rent burdened when they're paying above 30%. And even as we rent apartments, if folks don't have rental assistance from the federal government, they're often paying 40%. Even the affordable apartments, they're walking in and having to use 40% of their income for rent today.
Well, and that kind of gets to the notion that, like, when we say estimated Vermont renters with enough income to purchase a medium price home, they probably can't afford the rental they're in either. It's just we're not running that number. You know what I mean? It's like because the rental's not necessarily cheaper than the $2,300.
Some may be rent burdened even as they look at home ownership. Yes.
Right. So it's sort of like,
you know, but always the advantage to home ownership is you're building some equity, hopefully, unless there's a big downturn in the economy. Home ownership work. We have worked extensively with Habitat for Humanity. They knock out 5 to 7 homes for us every year down in Manchester. The chapter actually got themselves a site where over 10 years, they've built about 14 homes. I think there's 6 more to go. This single mom and her son got to buy one of those houses. Champlain Housing Trust opened this condominium in downtown Winooski. The city provided the land for free. And we use something called shared appreciation to help households into housing. And that allows, again, the subsidy to be recycled. There's a quintessential Vermont that has shown this committee in Vermont in the past, in southern Vermont, that we invested $12,000 in when it cost about $70,000 to buy back in the early 90s. It's now on its 4th homeowner. 2 of the 3 moved into conventional home ownership after being there for 5 or 6 years. 1 went back to renting, and there's a 4th family in there today. The advantage is that people are getting into housing at a much lower cost than they would if they had to pay full market value. So it's making housing available to people who would, and every year we have somewhere in the state 30 to 50 homes come back on the market, and they're generally available at prices below $170,000, sometimes significantly below that, because we invested in them many years ago. So we think it's been a great success and a great model.
Representative.
I'm curious, I'm on the Housing Trust Committee in my community, and I'm curious, I know that we wrote some RFPs and got the ARPA money. I was curious if there's data statewide on how the ARPA money has helped any projects, or maybe other folks have, but has it helped, like, with a lot of the housing?
We are seeing some communities put ARPA dollars into housing projects. We ask developers when they come to us seeking the state's resources to also ask the local communities. And we are seeing more and more local communities figuring out some way to help with housing. So again, St. Albans has used its TIF district to help provide housing. The city of Montpelier just bonded to buy land at the old Elks Golf Course, and they are talking about providing land for housing there. So communities are finding different ways to support housing. We are still finding community resistance in some parts of the state to housing as well, and that continues to be an issue.
We can get a fuller ARPA report over time from the administration. And TIF is tax increment financing districts, which are complex, and we'll spend more time on them at a later date.
A different form of home ownership that we've invested in has been mobile home parks. Many years ago, the state passed a law that provides time for residents when the park goes on the market, to buy it either as a co-op or through a nonprofit. We've been involved in helping 46 such communities with about 2,600 homes in them. The chief advantage to that is it helps the residents stabilize rents for the long term. But what I would say to you, and we're getting some good cooperation from the Agency of Natural Resources, and some new federal money for water and sewer, is most of these parks have older water and sewer systems, and they are going to need help. And so if I'm thinking about the work that this committee might do over time, it would include talking with ANR about what resources can be made available to help these communities modernize their water and sewer systems. There's also a program that was funded this year to help remove vacant and abandoned lots, get lots prepared for redevelopment in parks. Lots of issues with parks. In other parts of the country, you're seeing investors want to buy parks. I think our law has been a deterrent to that. And folks are really captive in these parks. So if somebody comes in and buys it, they can jack the rent up and people have no place to go. They can't move their homes very easily. They're not generally mobile, despite that as a name as mobile homes. They generally, especially older homes, not easily moved and no place to move.
Representative Lobel.
I'm probably way off base here.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm thinking about, all the homeless people that we have in the state. And I think I read in the paper something to the effect where we spent $426 million in the last 3 years in vouchers for them to stay in hotels or motels. Am I correct on that?
I don't have that number. I don't know what we've spent on the hotel program.
Well,
You should
I guess-
ask the Agency of Human Services that question.
I guess my point is that money being spent on vouchers, once it's spent, it's gone.
Correct.
And again, like I said, I'm probably way out there, but is it, and I don't know even if the state is, if they can legally do it, but could they buy land and put mobile homes on it and then bring the homeless and put them there? I mean, I don't mean to,
No, I understand what you're saying. And, with the dollars you've given us, we've been running around the state as fast as we could to create as many new housing options as possible. Among them have been, I think we've probably filled 14 or 15 vacancies around the state in mobile home parks with new mobile homes. So we put a couple homes in a park in Bradford, a few in Bristol. The state housing, the Housing Foundation Inc. is about to put 7 homes in 3 parks sometime in the next month or two. So we have tried to do that as a piece of the solution. What we have not wanted to do as a matter of policy has been to isolate people who are experiencing homelessness all in one place. We want to integrate people into the broader community to the extent we can, just as a better model for how people can reintegrate their lives and that kind of thing into the broader community.
We'll get a fuller picture of the amount of money spent, not only appropriated to VHCB and others for this kind of work, but also for the motel work. That'll come from a DCF or Department of Children and Families or the Office of Economic Opportunity or the Human Services, all of which are all wrapped into Human Services. I don't think $426 million is what we spent on motels. However, last year we were paying $115 a night for hotel rooms. So a month of that is $3,500 under the crisis of the instant. We had to spend that money because we didn't have a place to put them, but $3,500 a month is a substantial mortgage, or it could be a mortgage for a $500,000 home, depending on which, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get breakdowns over time of what we're spending or what we've spent, because another issue for us is going to be the motel program is going to run out of funding pretty soon, which will be another crisis of the instant. So we'll get there.
Okay. Thank you.
Or we'll get to an understanding of it. We may not solve the problem, but we'll get there.
Okay, this is a project a little larger than many we do, but a good example of the kind of fun work we've been doing with the ARPA and one-time funding and with our partners at DHFA. This is in Hartford, Vermont. It's just under construction. It got a large award from us. It has a large development cost. There are 8 apartments that are set aside for people who experience homelessness. There are also 12 that are above the tax credit guidelines that are not market rate, but closer to market rate to serve that essential workforce that we all want to serve that don't qualify for tax credit housing. This is also something we call a turnkey development. So private developer and DEW construction are building this and then flipping it at the end of construction to one of our nonprofit partners. So they'll make their money on the front end of the deal, but not on they won't be looking for profit at the back end in 10 or 20 years. And in a great smart growth location in Hartford. So this is, again, AMI for a single person in Vermont, just under $50,000. AMI, the eligibility at 80% would go up for a family of 2 or 3. I don't have those numbers with me today, but you can see there are any number of occupations here where people are making less than that. doing essential work that we all care about. Most of the housing that VHCB is involved in is primarily for people below 80%, but as we noted at the beginning of the presentation, we can go up to 100 for rental housing, up to median income for rental housing. We do that. We can go up to 120% for home ownership. As we indicated, we have begun a pilot program with the Champlain Housing Trust and in partnership with UVM Extension, and they're making great strides. And this is fundamentally an equity issue in improving the quality of housing for our farm workers across the state. We're using state funds for this in part because we don't want to have to deal with issues of qualifying people in terms of their residency status rather than federal funds. This is what homelessness looked like last January across the state. We meet regularly with the Agency of Human Services to look at these numbers. And we, as you can see, large numbers in Chittenden County, but not insignificant numbers in Rutland and Washington. You will see a shift in the most recent numbers, and that's partially because we've lost motel space in Chittenden County and a bunch of people have been relocated down to Rutland County in order to provide housing to them.
Representative Fabana?
When you say Vermonters facing homeless, like for instance, in my town of Caledonia, 139, is that individuals or families?
That's the number of households. Many of them are single households today. Okay, so since the pandemic, AHS reports that we have rehoused 2,800 families. We have about 1,700 families as of last month still experiencing homelessness in some part of the system or another. And but it was more than 1,700 individuals, and there were about 400 children who were homeless. And I guess this may be a challenging word for you, but I think I would ask you to think about this in the same way you do when you see pictures, whether from the border or other countries, as fundamentally a humanitarian crisis. We can't expect kids to learn in school when they are struggling with that level of instability in their lives. And you just think about, for anybody we may have known in our lives, when they, what goes to losing your home, even if they don't have kids, and what that does to their ability to function and be in the workforce or continue their education is really, really difficult.
Representative Parlow?
This might be a silly question, but is there a threshold of homelessness? I mean, is this including, anyone who might have experienced homelessness for a day? Is there a way to gauge that?
I'm sure there is. I am not the expert here. I don't.
That'll be an administration thing again to break us down.
Great.
Short answer, 30% or so of people experiencing homelessness is short term.
Okay.
Could be lost a job,
Great.
just needs cash to move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
Roughly 35% is more than just short term, it's medium term. They might need services, they might need assistance. We'll learn about the three-legged stool when it comes to how we're dealing with homelessness. But about 30% of the people are chronic.
Okay.
So there are people who need extensive services. But again, and vocab check, households is how people refer to it. Could be a single person, could be a couple with or without a child. So a household could have up to 3 or 4 people in it.
Okay.
But it could also be one person. So there's when we have the administration come in, when we have folks from OEO come in, we'll get a finer understanding. But believe it or not, that was the short answer.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
But I guess I would also say to you, if you have somebody who is fleeing domestic violence,
Mm-hmm.
they may not have been homeless very long, but they don't have a safe place to return to.
Exactly. I think
And
that was
they-
more my question. Are those individuals included in these
Yes.
numbers? Okay.
And we'll also hear just about in the case of somebody fleeing domestic violence, and people experiencing homelessness, going from what was their home to perhaps their car to a shelter, to the bureaucracy that has, that they have to deal with in order to get vouchers for hotel rooms, et cetera, all the way up the ladder to getting back into a stable living environment.
Great.
Representative Ladai?
Yeah, I just want to just go back to what you said, Gus, about, how it affects the children. My wife is a school bus driver and she picks up 3 kids at the hotel. And prior to Christmas, they thought they were going to get booted out because I guess the money wasn't coming in. And they were crying and she's trying to console them, and then I don't know how many rooms they got, between that family, but, trying to cram everybody into one room, trying to study, and we're talking about grade school kids and how it just, turns their life upside down. And not just that, but sometimes they have to go from town to another town. And, they're just getting comfortable with the teachers, with the school bus driver, with their friends. And once you take that away from them, it's starting from ground zero again. And so, that's why I think it's extremely important that we have these housing facilities so that they have stability, and not just for the children, but of course for the parents too. And so I really appreciate all the work you've been doing.
Thank you. Okay. So this is just an example of some work that's recently been done here in central Vermont. And in 2 different facilities, we ended up adding 50 beds in the way of emergency shelter capacity, and not in the old style, 50 cots lined up next to each other. This is a former motel on the Barry Montpelier Road. There's another building over in South Barry, and it's kind of 2 people to a room, far safer than the pre-COVID kind of facility that the Good Samaritan Haven was operating out of their first building in Barry City. But despite that, and as you saw in the numbers, and you see again with the more recent numbers, we still, despite adding 50 beds, a large number of people camping out behind the Price Chopper over in Berlin. We still have a good ways to go here in central Vermont. Across the state, and this goes to COVID-19 and the housing crisis, we have been working as hard and fast as we could to get facilities. This building in Rutland, it's a former Catholic school. We had a great opening, and when the Rutland delegation showed up, we heard lots of stories about their CYO basketball games because the event in the gym. Half the building is for people experiencing homelessness and half for just general housing. Steps, the domestic violence organization for Chittenden County, had just 7 rooms available to them pre-pandemic. With the help of the Champlain Housing Trust, they now have 21 units of housing available to people dealing with domestic violence. So a great addition in terms of their facility.
Representative Howard from Rutland.
Yes, I did tour Lincoln Place, and it was just fantastic. Looking at this picture, I see Immaculate Heart behind it, which is vacant. Have you ever refurbished a church for apartments?
I'm not going to say never because, when you get to my age, you may not remember every single project that you ever were involved in. There's a little project up in Coventry that was, I think, both a library and a schoolhouse and another building that was converted to housing some years ago. We have done, I'm going to say, 15 school conversions around the state over the years. So I can't think of a church offhand that we converted to housing, but maybe we did, and I'm just not remembering it at this moment.
I've been told that it's very expensive to do,
Oh, sure.
very expensive.
Yep.
Representative President.
I was just gonna add, in Winooski, I believe, developers just purchased, a church there that they're turning into housing, but they have the money to do so. So see what happens there, but hopefully it'll be affordable. I don't know yet.
One of the hard things about homelessness and for our Vermonters who are experiencing it, just to keep track, when COVID hit, up until COVID, we relied on what's called the point in time count to give us an idea of how many people were experiencing homelessness or who were potentially suffering from homelessness at some level. They might have been couch surfing or sleeping in cars. And that number, we were always told, was not scientific. It was based on statistics and some door knocking and whatnot. And we ranged from 1,100 to 1,400 Vermonters. That was always the number we got back in the spring. COVID showed us, because shelters were closed, and because we could count people through the continuum of care, that the number was twice that as a rule. And we're seeing that the number, just based on that slide that you showed several slides ago, while we have housed upwards of 2,800 Vermonters, there still could be as many as 2,500 or 2,700. It's not a static, the people come in, people come out, and that's what's difficult about quote unquote solving this problem. But producing, we simply do not have enough places to put anybody, and so that's what we're working against. I see 500 set aside. 22% of new units are being developed that people are. I mean, we're making strides, but it is to Gus's point about it being a humanitarian crisis. If you do not have a place to put people, no matter whether they can afford to live in a place or not, it is a fault of our culture right now. So it's there are days where I feel like we're treading water, but again, I can't say that we're treading water if we found places, if we were able to house 2,700 people. But it is ongoing. It's just ongoing.
Okay, so I'm just noticing we're gonna lose battery, so I've got about 8 slides to get through, but you'll also probably want me to stop talking pretty soon. But I'll try to run through these pretty quickly. So these are the numbers since the pandemic began, of $190 million awarded for 38 communities in 13 counties, over 1,500 rental homes, 1/3 for folks experiencing homelessness, and 475 shelter beds either improved, or about 160 of them are new beds across the state, as we just showed you a moment ago. We don't do this work alone. We talked a lot in the presentation to the General Assembly a few weeks ago about the Housing Recovery Working Group that both Maura and I are a part of. So the rental assistance program, which is not the same as your question earlier about how much do we spend on motels, has provided $154 million for 34,000 Vermonters. The VHIP program was at 383 units when we put this slide together. The HFA's mortgage program, which I'm sure Maura will talk about this afternoon, over 4,000 households helped. And the shelter network also providing 2,600 Vermonters with assistance. I do want to say, and I said this a few weeks ago, when I was working in community action in the late 70s, we did not have a shelter system in the state of Vermont because we didn't need one. It was really only in the early 80s that we began to need a shelter system, that COTS got organized, the Good Samaritan Haven, the Upper Valley Haven. So I don't think it's impossible to solve this problem, but it is a question of political will and dollars. There was just a great story in Vermont Digger about this motel that has been converted to permanent housing. I think before that, CHD used it to house refugees from Afghanistan. Chris is nodding his head positively. And it was just a heartwarming story in Digger just earlier this week that you should all take a look at. This is a recovery residence in Barre. My friend Jalinda LeClaire headed up the Governor's Opioid Council for a couple of years, and she told me that the very most important thing we could do was to create recovery residences around the state. This one is opening this month. We had a ceremony for it in December in Barre. There are projects that should be underway in Bennington, 2 in Bennington, and then another one up at 40th and Allen. When do you hope to finish that one, Chris?
Next 6 months.
Okay, so we are working on the opioid crisis by providing this kind of assistance. Status of FY '22 and '23 special appropriations, which totaled $229 million, some from ARPA and some from the general fund. We expect to fully commit our ARPA funding at our January board meeting. We expect about $37 million to be available from the one-time general funds. After the January board meeting, we have board meetings in May and June. We expect more than $37 million in applications for that assistance. I will note that there is not any money yet in the Budget Adjustment Act to continue this work. That may be an issue that you and the appropriation, if colleagues on appropriations want to take up. But from my perspective, while I can't tell you we would spend the money by the end of the fiscal year, what I can tell you is that what you've done the last 2 years in appropriating funds in the Budget Adjustment Act will send a signal to the development community that they should bring us more applications. And that's a really important signal to take note of. Future pipeline. As we measure it, we could do another 2,000 homes, probably cost us, our share, at least $185 million, maybe more than that as prices continue to go up. We have lots of demand for agriculture and natural resources across the state as well. And then just to, as we wrap up here, I just want to, again, the building on the left is in St. Johnsbury. It was once the jail, converted to an office. It was empty. It will now be housing. There's another building down the street from here that was fire damaged that's being put back to work. On the right are 2 buildings in Hartford, Vermont. And what this chart tells you, as your constituents say, none of you have represent any community in which somebody wouldn't say they haven't done enough yet. That would be true whether you're in Brattleboro, in St. Albans, in Newport, in Montpelier. We haven't. We have not yet met the need. But what this chart on the bottom is telling you is over this fiscal year, we will have 623 units get under construction and 461 get completed. That's a lot. 1,000 units started or completed this year. And there'll be more that we've funded that will be completed in the next year. So work is underway wherever you go across the state of Vermont. Opportunities and challenges. And I spoke to this when I spoke to all of you in that orientation. Chair has been a great supporter of the property transfer tax. We need it only to go up about $3.5 million this year to be fully funded for the first time since Governor Shumlin's first year in office. Every other year, the appropriators have diverted funds to some other important need in state government. I hope there'll be more allocations of one-time funding. I don't know what the governor's plans are. As I said, there's nothing in the Budget Adjustment Act, and I hope some of you can be advocates for finding some of those dollars. We do need smart growth. We work closely with the Department of Housing and Community Development on how do we build our core centers and make them more vibrant. I think I said this a few weeks ago, but when Howard Dean gave his farewell speech, he said if Vermont doesn't want to sprawl into the countryside and disrupt the farm fields and the forests that we all love, we need to grow taller. We need to grow vertically. We need taller buildings in our town and village centers. And I think that that's true today. It doesn't mean we shouldn't ever go outside of the existing boundaries, but I think we do need to think about letting people build higher buildings, having more density, and having more vibrancy in our core communities. For some communities, that's going to mean making infrastructure dollars available. Again, the bipartisan infrastructure plan that passed Congress last year is going to provide over 4 or 5 or 6 years infrastructure dollars for water, sewer, sidewalks, roads, the state of Vermont. And there's a program at the department called the Neighborhood Partnership Program. It's a pilot with just $1 million in it, but I'd love to see VTrans and ANR not just pursue their own priorities, but use some of that infrastructure funding to help communities build more housing and take the cost of infrastructure off of developers' backs. That becomes a big cost when you're trying to build housing. So if we could take that out of the equation, it would make the price go down some. We began our partnership with the Scott administration when the governor proposed a housing revenue bond. I don't know that that's appropriate yet this year, but I hope that you can have a discussion about that. I know Chair Stevens, bonding is not your favorite method of funding, but I think we need to think about another housing bond into the future. There is more and more, as I said, municipal support for housing, but there are challenges. That includes opposition and the appeals process, which takes too long. And I'm a big supporter of the work that Representative Bongartz has been doing to encourage more density and to affect our zoning. I don't think his bill is going to have any kind of process that that deals with the appeals process, which is very long. A project in Putney was appealed last year by a single resident, though it had the community's full support. The case hasn't been heard yet. It'll be next spring. And a project that might have cost 25 units, $10 million could end up costing $12 million by the time the appeal's settled.
Representative.
Yeah, just a quick question. For your bonding, you go through Vermont Bond Bank exclusively. Is that your source of bonding?
No, what the legislature did was to have the treasurer issue a bond and created revenue sources to pay for it.
So it's totally separate from the Vermont Bond Bank's capacity.
Yes.
It doesn't take their capacity.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the treasurer, when we did the original bond, I think the Treasurer Pierce thought it was not going to be part of the state's consideration of total indebtedness. And then as the bond people looked at it, they said, oh, yes, it is, even though you created special financing for it. But lots of states, especially California and counties, have been bonding. So I think when we've exhausted the one-time funding in ARPA, we've got to look at that. And the thing I would say to you is, as frightening as I find the cost of housing today, in the years that I've done this work, while I've occasionally seen a couple of years where prices stabilized or went down a tiny amount, they never went down to the prior levels. So people may say this is way too expensive at current costs. There's no reason to think it'll be less expensive in 5 years.
The only reason I ask is because I know that with having served on education, the unmet needs in school construction and rehabilitation currently exceed any theoretical capacity of the Vermont Bond Bank, and that's the source for all of that money. And so I'm just always curious what else we're looking at the bond bank for when it's going to be fairly stressed, even if we just try to encounter our school construction needs.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a new bond would be issued that wouldn't flow through that capacity.
I think that's a hard question we need to figure out of how would we provide that capacity. And I'm not the fiscal expert to answer that question. I'm just saying if we're headed to a time where the state budget's going to get much tighter than it's been, that this is a capital investment, and the value is that when the bonds are paid off, the state will still have the assets as community assets.
So we'll, as we look at this in the future, again, there's the streams of potential income, and we'll get into more details later on. The difference between the kind of money that gets raised, the cash that gets raised through the property transfer tax, and how it can be used and how it can be leveraged versus the ARPA money versus bonding money, and those all have nuances and, again, benefits and challenges within them. I mean, for instance, the last bond, at a time when the administration was not fully funding the property transfer tax, part of the deal was that a chunk of money from the property transfer tax was being used to pay down the bond and not for new building. And so how that gets managed, and then of course the change in how it was being regarded as the state debt put a dent in our enthusiasm for it, at least short term. So it's just another stream to look at, and we learned quite a bit from the bond that was issued 5 years ago. So,
Representative sometimes. Wondering if in rural areas where there's unlikely to be a 10-unit development, but there are a lot of large houses with older people living in them and the potential for another living space within that house. Do you have any involvement in those kind of single unit projects?
I'm going to say two different things. I think that's a place where the VHIP program can help, and there's a provision for accessory dwelling units as well as part of that process. We have done a number of old white elephant buildings, and as I was describing a project we did some years ago in Coventry, 3 different buildings I think got turned into 11 apartments. So that's when we get into those kinds of things. We did something in the village of Groton probably 15 or 20 years ago that involved 4 or 5 different buildings. We're in the midst of this revitalization of the East Calais General Store that has 3 apartments behind it. So we occasionally do small projects. One of the things I think we need to do with our small villages, and this is not just for housing, is to help them when they want to, and Montgomery is doing this now, develop public water and sewer systems when they don't have them. And that will make it easier whether you're a for-profit or a nonprofit developer to build housing in those rural villages. Really hard when all the systems need to be on-site systems, both from a permitting perspective and a cost perspective, though we've done it on more than one occasion. So, but when you're trying to get a lot of housing built as quickly as possible, doing 1 unit at a time is not necessarily going to get you to that goal as quickly as you like, though I completely recognize the potential for community revitalization. I remember having a conversation with some farmers in Addison County, I think in Orwell, and I was talking to a fellow I'd known for 25 years. And he said to me, there's 70 old women in this town, and he may have been related to half of them, living in big old farmhouses by themselves. And what he wanted was to have elderly housing built in the village, not far from the health center, so that people would move out of their big old houses and they'd get some young people into their communities. So, anything we do in the housing continuum helps some. When you have the kind of crisis we've had, we've been trying, and Vermont's led the country in this along with California, to do things as fast as possible, to do things like convert hotels into houses, to place mobile homes into manufactured housing communities. So I think your idea has merit. It's just very hard to scale up a program around that. There are a bunch of other challenges. I feel like I've used the time that Ron told me that I had, along with the battery power. But I do want to say to each of you, and I'm happy to sit here and answer more questions. This is the last slide. This picture in Bristol, I think, is illustrative of a couple things. And this project is just under construction across from the firehouse about 2 months ago. One is that infrastructure got to this neighborhood. Second, there was a private developer who wanted to do this. And as I talked to you about condominiums, when he got to the point that he was going to have to sell condominiums for over $300,000 a unit, he said, this is too risky. It just doesn't pencil for me. So it wasn't the bank in that case. He said, I can't take on this risk. I don't know this to be true. This is your community representative, Elder, but as I look at the site, I guess I just wonder if we could have built more than the 20 units by going up one more story. And maybe there's reasons that these are 2-story buildings that I don't know. But when I say we should build vertically in Vermont, this would be a good example of why not 3-story buildings. And maybe there were issues around parking or something else that made them 2-story buildings. But I think that's an example of, we should always be asking ourselves, can we add 1 more story, 2 more stories, and get the density?
It probably relates to some of our Act 250 conversations, just because I happen to know that developer, by the time they were selling the project, they needed to move forward with what was permitted and not something that wasn't permitted, because otherwise you couldn't go back and reopen that door. So if in the intervening years, it would have made more sense to go to 3 stories or something, as they abandoned that project financially, it wasn't, you know, sticking to the existing permit was incredibly important.
And this is one more example of the value of the nonprofit network, because this fellow was just not going to proceed with this project. And so the nonprofits came forward, Evernorth and the Addison County Community Trust, to take it on when he said, this doesn't pencil for me anymore. I can't make this work financially. It's too risky.
And that kind of partnership also happened here in Montpelier with where the bus station is. Private developers could not pencil building 20 some odd units on top of that garage, and Down Street came in and was able to work a deal. Some of the local opposition or things that we will deal with as a committee, we can think about in theory. It would be really nice if all the old women could move downtown into senior living that have, you know, all the services that you need. Try to get people to move out of their homes that they've been living in for, you know, that have been part of a family for, you know, so there's that emotional aspect. But for us, the difference between balancing off what we think is great public policy versus the fact that this is private ownership. This is land. This is something that we, you know, for the most part, we want people to own their homes, or they're connected to what they own. And so it's a real delicate balance sometimes about, we can imagine that people will want to move downtown to be near the health center, but whether they will or not is up to them. And so, you know, this industry, I sometimes jokingly call it the affordable housing industrial complex, has been this, it's really well thought out, which is why I give it that name. But the ideas here are, over time, some of it has been reactive. There's a fire downtown. We want to help that downtown come back, and so we're there to help. We're in a period of time, and have been now for some time, of some of this building needs to be proactive. How can we go out and seek the land? How can we seek the projects? How can we seek the funding? And it ebbs and flows, and every town is different. So as we deal with these organizations, as we deal with the housing issues that are in front of us, just keep that in mind. You know, the theory of what we can think about in this building and in this world, and is fine as far as it goes. But when you have local opposition, even in my hometown, we had a very hearty conversation over whether we should take a building or a building that had been destroyed in the flood, had been taken down in the 10 years, somewhere over the 10 years. And Down Street wanted to buy them, and the people who owned it, which was our utility district, wanted to sell it to Down Street for its appraised price. So the nonprofit agency wasn't getting a deal per se. There was a really hearty conversation. It wasn't a slam dunk. You know, people were saying, why don't private developers have the same chance? It's like, well, for the same amount of money, private developers are going to build a 7-unit building, not a 25-unit building. It's too much for our downtown. It's village character. All of these words that you'll hear that oppose things are exclusionary at times, and they're traditional, and you know, but the fact is that we had a water and sewer line that goes by, it's brand new, and it should be more densely developed. How Waterbury is going to get there is not, it's not a slam dunk. Every project is going to be a conversation. So these folks have been at the core of trying to maintain these values that they explained here, and which this committee in general has been supportive of, because of its anti-sprawl nature, its anti-poverty nature, its ability to try to, and now extend it. Now, I was going to interrupt earlier and quiz you on the number that Gus put up of $49,000, which is 80% of the state AMI, or 49,000. And you know, yesterday I used the number of, there's 225,000 Vermont income taxpayers who file income tax returns for $47,000 or less. That's what we're dealing with.
So I guess I would just wrap up, and I'm happy, again, to answer more questions and stay here, but to say, whether you're focused on housing or any of the other programs we talked about, you know, the Rural Economic Development Initiative to support a project in your community. You know, a different example from the two I gave was we helped Run Amok Maple a few years ago get a grant that helped them turn the old Scrabble factory into a productive facility.
Good job.
Yeah, whatever the idea is, please make our phones ring. The worst we could do is say, we can't do that right now, but it's a good idea. And we may be able to do more. So whether it's our conservation programs, our farm viability program, or our housing programs, or you see something new we should be thinking about, all ideas are welcome. And you all know your communities way better than we do. That's one of the things I've learned over doing this all these years. I may think I know something about Wyndham, but I can't possibly know it as well as you do. I can't know Waterbury as well as the chair does. So please ask us on behalf of your constituents about anything that you think we may be able to be helpful with. And I really appreciate the time and attention. And Polly and I are happy to come back at any time to go deeper on any of this, but I hope this was a good overview.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Questions right now?
Thank you.
Thank
So-
you.
So committee, let's, Gus and Polly, thank you so much. Glad you had enough battery to get through.
Yeah.
This morning.
And I mean that both for your computer and for your voices, for Gus, for your voice. No, we will have you back. I mean, obviously, this is what we're focusing on this year. So we will be in touch not only to, and I think Polly, I don't know how much of your, I know we'll have a new federal housing person to talk to, but I'm hoping that you can help us translate some of the federal impacts that may have passed as well.
Once a congressional staffer, always a congressional staffer. Happy to talk about federal programs.
Yeah, it's there's potentially a lot there for us. So thank you for your time. That was 2 hours. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So thank you so much, committee. Let's